larger muscles and obtain a suntan for cosmetic reasons, in other words, to improve their appearance, nature evolved these capacities as adaptive responses to intense physical stresses. The buildup of muscles or melanin, skin pigment beyond normal levels, represent defensive barriers against future assaults from high-intensity physical stress, namely anaerobic bodybuilding and ultraviolet sunlight stress. In the late 1800s, the famous French physiologist Claude Bernard stated that the ability of living organisms to maintain the constancy of their internal physiologic milieu or environment despite changes in the external environment is their most salient physical characteristic. For example, an individual exposed to fluctuations in atmospheric temperatures doesn't experience much, if any, of a change in body temperature unless, of course, he's thrown into the fire or stuck into the polar ice cap. An individual can also eat large quantities of a particular food substance without fearing the altering of the composition of his blood. The capacity to maintain a constant internal environment, as you may have learned in college or high school biology, is known as homeostasis, which means to keep a similar position. The body, however, is very economical with its reserve of adaptive resources and will not disrupt its homeostatic balance by using these resources unless there is sufficient reason to do so. And only a high-intensity stress is sufficiently threatening to the body's reserve of resources that it will defend itself by developing an adaptive barrier. In other words, if you were to continue to go out into the August sunlight and your body didn't develop that defensive barrier known as a suntan, it would kill you. The adaptive process, therefore, is essentially defensive in nature. And the degree to which an adaptive response is stimulated is directly proportional to the intensity of the stressor. Again, you can sit in front of a 100-watt light bulb for an infinity of eternities. You're never going to get a suntan because the intensity of the light stress is not threatening your body enough to cause an adaptive response, the building of a defensive barrier, or suntan. Remember, the degree to which your adaptive response, whether it's a muscle buildup or a suntan buildup, the degree of your adaptive response is directly proportional to the intensity of the stress. And it's an either-or situation. Either the intensity of the stress is high enough or it's not. Like Arthur Jones years ago liked to do, he would liken building muscles with barbells to exploding a piece of dynamite with a hammer. He would say, Mike Mentzer, it only requires one well-placed blow from a hammer to stimulate a piece of dynamite to explode. Any number of lighter blows will not do the trick. Same thing in bodybuilding. Nature, reality and its laws, the laws of nature require that you impose a high-intensity training stress on your delicate physiology to threaten it enough so the body adapts by getting bigger muscles. And if you don't want to go to failure, you can't make up for it by doing a number of candy-ass, mamby-pamby lighter sets. Let's say that each and every one of you in here was just as avid a suntanner as you are a bodybuilder. In other words, your desire for achieving the greatest suntan possible is just as great as your desire to build big muscles. And given your earnest desire, every summer you move to Africa at the equator because that's where, of course, the intensity, you see how the term intensity really is used scientifically here. You have high-intensity sunlight, high-intensity radio waves. You would move, in your desire to get a great suntan, you move to the equator every summer, knowing, not fretting even slightly, there would be no slightest concern that by the end of the summer, you would have a great suntan, now would there? Right? Why? Because the intensity of the ultraviolet sunlight stress at the equator is considerably greater than anywhere else in the world. So, not only would you not fret about obtaining the best suntan possible by the end of the summer, you would not fret either that the intensity of the physical stress was high enough to cause an adaptive response, i.e. a suntan buildup. What would be your overwhelming concern? Not the intensity.
Not getting burned.
Not overexposing yourself to the stress. Not the intensity, but you would have no slightest concern that the intensity of the stress was sufficiently high to stimulate that adaptive response we know as a suntan buildup. You would have one overwhelming concern, and that would be to precisely regulate the volume and frequency of the exposure. Any more than that is overdosing on the stress. A sunburn. When do you get a better suntan? In January or August? Why? Because the intensity of the physical stress is much greater. In January, you can expose your skin for several hours to the sunlight. You won't get a sunburn, but you won't get a suntan either. January sunlight is more like aerobic, low intensity, long duration. You can do aerobics for a long time. You won't build big muscles, but you won't overtrain either. Now, in August, when the intensity of the sunlight is very high, you will obtain a suntan without a doubt. But what happens when you expose your skin for even 1 minute longer than is precisely required by nature? You burn. What do you think might happen, ladies and gentlemen, if you were to perform 1 set more of high-intensity anaerobic bodybuilding stress than is required by nature? Overtraining is the equivalent of an exercise sunburn. Overtraining, in other words, is not something kind of, sort of negative. It's the worst training mistake you can make.